Hello and welcome to the Kuyumungi Institute, our Q&A conversation for exploration series. I'm Paul Robert, the Executive Director and President of the Institute, along with my wife, Laura Lee, the Director of Research, Education, and Outreach. And on behalf of our Board of Directors, our advisors, our supporting members, our volunteers, we want to thank you for joining us today. The Kuyumungi Institute is an independent nonprofit research organization committed to researching consciousness and the human experience, following the footsteps of our founder, anthropologist, Dr. Felicitas Goodman. And our focus is reflected in three main areas: experience, education, and exploration. We continue to respect the path of academic balance, the creative pursuit of science, while advancing, conserving, and restoring a direct experience of that deeper human connection to all of life. So it's part of our mission to expand our own experiential research with the multidisciplinary understanding that's available to us today. These interviews, these discussions, we've been doing these now for many years, and on our website, you're welcome to join in. They're all for free. There's probably 150 these kinds of discussions. Plus, we also have regular podcasts, another 100 or so of those that are up. So please do join us at kuyumungiinstitute.com. You're welcome to enjoy and be a part of the ongoing exploration of this work. Today, what are we going to talk about, Laura?
We're on a trip, and it was a good time to see old and new friends. And at a party, a couple parties that we were invited by our good friend Lauren Archer, we met our guest today. And this was when we dropped into a really friendly joust between a doom and gloom perspective and hope. And you probably can guess which side that I was wanting to hear more of. So we will today, a message of hope posited by our guest, Josh Nowlis, a marine biologist, official title, senior economist and fisheries scientist. He says he has every hope. He says from his work that the oceans are recovering. He sees hope for the future, for our planet. And this is a lesson also, I think, in listening to one another to find ways to achieve those means by which we can support our planet in its recovery. It's really about our recovery, isn't it, as well? And how we can listen to one another. I've always said in my career, it's not heavy lifting, it's really heavy listening. And that's a skill set that Josh can tell us some stories, how he's employed really divisive groups to find a common solution. We all want to find a way to make a better world and to make a better humanity, do we not? And I think that here's a scientist that's been in the trenches with making public policies by listening to all sides and finding ways to go forward for the sake of our planet. You know, in everything that we do, we're so business oriented in our society, right? These are the movers and shakers, is how we progress. But I think that stakeholders are going beyond shareholders, and that everything that we do in our world now, especially on the global scale in which we operate, because we're really in one big giant petri dish called planet Earth, in one big cosmos, right? We need to think about these larger and larger perspectives, because everything we do affects everything else. Every breath ripples out far beyond our own sphere. And we're going to hear some very practical and positive solutions from a man who's been doing it for a long time. Welcome, Josh.
Hey, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I'm grateful to you for the opportunity.
Yeah, I think you're going to impart some lessons that we can all try to employ, large and small, in our world. But tell me, what is it? How do you describe what you do? How did you what was the aha moment that led you to the work that you do? Tell us a bit of
Right.
your backstory.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. So I'm going to give you just a taste and we'll dig into whatever
All right.
whatever you want to start with. I grew up being really good at math and science, and I actually see a couple of friends that I grew up with who can vouch for this. Had kind of a reputation, and there was a lot of I felt social pressure even as a kid that I was supposed to go and do some kind of groundbreaking scientific work like astrophysics or something.
You
And
just
nothing
had an
wrong.
inkling. That's my destiny. I've got work to do here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I literally that was a message I received from people, but my inner self always responded by that by saying, "Wait a second. I'm really interested in the humanity around me and doing something that's going to serve that, and I'm not sure that astrophysics is the right path for me." Again, nothing wrong with astrophysics. I started out as a college major in it. So my career has really been a journey about how to take a combination of skills in science and analysis, along with which is, something I've done a ton of training in, combined with people skills, which I think are, more of an innate thing, but where I've focused on that a lot more later in my career, to be able to figure out ways to make science transform from a blunt weapon that we beat each other around the head with, to something that brings us together.
All right. The healing aspect of science,
Absolutely.
the community aspect of science.
Right. Absolutely.
What in you as a young man gave you such a lofty ideal goal? This is a spiritual goal, really.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, there's both positives and negatives about that. I came from a family where my grandfather, grandmother, father, uncle, brother had PhDs. My other brother, my sister, my uncle had law degrees. And so I grew up with very high expectations for me to do some kind of achievement like that. But that was combined with also a lot of support for being able to go and really trust my mind to be able to figure out some things. And I'm grateful that because math and science came so quickly and easily to me, that it lended like a self-confidence to be able to say, I'm going to try something different. I know that nobody does it this way. And I know that I'm supposed to do this other thing because that's how I've established myself. But I had this almost unbreakable confidence that I could just go and do something different. So as an example of that, I went into a PhD program a week after I graduated undergrad. I was 21 years old at the beginning of that. At the time, there was no such thing as a field of environmental science. So I went into a traditional ecology program with the intention of doing what now is referred to as environmental science. The faculty of the program I was in were very against this. And my grandfather, who was a great role model and had been an academic, was very against this. And I was like, it's going to work out. And sure enough, it did. Within 2 years of graduating from that program, I was doing exactly the sort of stuff that I wanted to do, even though that job literally didn't exist before that. So,
you followed some kind of inner voice, inner intuition.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Heavy listening.
Yep.
To all those voices. So how do you describe what you do today?
So there's various aspects of it that are more technical and important, but less interesting. I think the stuff that really, where my passion really lies, is in community engagements. And so through experience, a lot of experience, and then also some study, but really a lot of experience out there in the world, I have learned, well, let me start by saying I'm very fortunate that I get to go into communities as identified as a scientific expert. And so that gives me a certain amount of leadership position and latitude to be able to do what I do. And what I like to do is go in there and shatter everybody's expectations by not coming in and lecturing everybody, but instead asking them lots of questions of, why are we here? What's going right? What's going wrong? What are your hopes, dreams, and fears? And it turns out that that's extremely disarming. People tend to be defensive of me, thinking I'm going to tell them what to do. And so when I come in and ask them, what can I do for you? It really engages people. So I'm very fortunate. I'm not sure everybody could replicate that as easily as I can, but because of the dynamic of that, I can come in and change the whole discussion. So then now we have a whole discussion, and what I do is actually create a process to not just identify the conflicts that exist and get people talking constructively about how we address those conflicts, how we find compromise in the trade-offs, but recognizing that what we're really doing with public policy is that we are navigating our way through an uncertain future. So I develop processes with the communities that I work with, so that we're not just saying this is the right answer, this is the wrong answer. So here's the winner.
Because we really don't know, do we?
We don't know exactly the what is an overriding consideration with I think almost every public policy issue that's like really important to people is that we're trying to navigate our way through this, opaque, we don't really know what's going to happen in the future. So coming up with a process rather than a solution turns out to really engage people. It brings out creative juices. It allows us to be able to start to build connections between people that used to be in conflict. And in the end, most of the time, vast majority of the time, we end up with a community that has bonded around the idea that we're in this together, and we've all been heard. We all have our considerations up there in design, specifically in the process. And as a result of that, people are willing to go along with it.
Well, what you're saying is important because of how the applications of how we all probably should be spending more time in that skill set of understanding how our relationship with those around us, the world we live in, that there's a format for being productive and there's a format for not being productive. And so what you're bringing to the table is how can we have some of the experience that you've had in the field of science and working in the industries that you work in, and how do those apply in today's world for us that are living everyday lives and how we communicate? And of course, we know the political spectrum is pretty broad nowadays, and there's so much pulling and miscommunication. And so, with all of that, I love the fact that you're saying let's find that formula. In fact, in today's chat room, I see a name on the wall, but it reminds me of a story. Years ago, Alan Isman, who's in the room today, was on our board of directors. He volunteered 10 years ago to help us out and get us launched, and he works in the fisheries also. And we had a board meeting, and Laura's talking, and I'm talking, and Laura's talking, and then another person's talking, and he says, I'd like to make a recommendation. I said, well, what's that? Well, he says, when I attend these meetings with the indigenous cultures in the Pacific Northwest.
Because he also worked in fisheries.
Each one of these meetings, they use the talking stick method. They don't talk over each other. So, and they take their time and they'll say, well, I'm thinking that maybe we should do this. And then he puts the stick down and there's silence. Then someone picks up the stick. You know what Joe just said makes sense to me as well. And I'm thinking that maybe we should also build on that by doing, etc. Lays the stick down. And it was just like all of a sudden,
everyone's
it changes
heard
the entire dynamic of how things can be built. And so we had to look, in Alan's case, it was fortunate for us that he brought that indigenous perspective into how to have a meeting. Because the Western brain's going boom, boom, boom.
If I can add to that, we did exactly that. And we would go around the circle
multiple times,
just how people were sitting around the table.
Until we ran out of time.
And what we found was that those people who wouldn't have otherwise spoken up really did have a lot to say. And we needed to stop and listen to them. And then we reached consensus on every decision we would go around until we reached consensus. So what an effective way. So in many way, we put that into place. So you're working in fisheries and you're going to communities where those people who live there know that environment intimately, because every ecosystem has its own intricacies and nuances and special dynamics. So what a resource they are. Were they not listened to in other situations?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I love the talking stick concept in public policy arenas. This has been true for fisheries for a long time, so I think I had a preview of what was to come. it's typically the case that fishing communities themselves, the fisher folk, the ones that go out and are using the ocean as a way of supporting themselves,
Right
their families,
there
their
in the
communities,
environment. Yeah.
they typically feel extremely disempowered from the political or public policy. And so there's a great opportunity there, in that I've found when I've had the opportunity to go in and basically just be an advisor to those communities, to give them some support for having their voices heard, which includes some science advice. But Laura, is the point you're making, they understand their environment extremely well. I don't need to come and lecture them about their ocean. But what I do is to provide them with a way of being able to use language that gets them heard in the public policy arena. And then by my presence as somebody who's seen as, I'm very welcome in the public policy arena. So I can bring them in that way. And I think maybe I'll share a quick story, if that's all right, of one of my first experiences with this, because I think it says a lot about all of the issues we're talking about. So my first job ever was as a professor at the University of the Virgin Islands, which was a really interesting experience. I was very much an outsider in the local culture, and for better and worse. I learned so much about people and community from that. But despite the fact that my job was quite literally defined as being a support person for the Virgin Islands government on environmental issues, and fisheries were one of the biggest issues there, the fisheries department in that government kept me separated from the fishing community. And so it wasn't until I was about to leave to go off and get a different job when I was finally invited to give a presentation to the fishing community. And the expectation was I was going to come in and lecture them about why they needed to close certain areas off to all forms of fishing, which is extremely contentious. This is a very popular technique that people use all over the world. I was a world expert in how to design these areas, so it was natural for me to give a presentation like that. But when you ask a fishing community to give up certain areas, you're not just asking everybody to make a little sacrifice. You're asking the people that have fished there for literally generations, who grew up learning the intricacies of their particular fishing site, to have to go and start from scratch somewhere else. And in doing so, to now be in competition with a neighbor of theirs. So they were very angry about this idea. They didn't like it at all. And if I had come in and done what I was asked, give them a lecture about you need to close these areas, it would have just sailed right over their head. So instead, I did what I described earlier. I said, I'm supposed to lecture about this, but I'd really much prefer to hear about what's going on with you. And what was supposed to be a 30-minute presentation turned into a 3-hour group therapy session, essentially. There were tremendous amounts of frustrations that had built up within that community. There were tears and hugs and all kinds of things that I never would have been part of if it had been me just coming in and lecturing them. And at the end of that 3 hours, I committed to them that if they wanted to address the issues that were being brought up by the agency that was pushing this agenda in a way that was actually legitimate, they were coming up with real proposals to address the real problems that were there, that I would give them all kinds of feedback on their proposals so that they could hone them. And that if they came up with something that I thought was legitimate, I would personally go to the agency and say, here's a legitimate proposal. And they embrace this thing. And mind you, this has been an issue that had been going on for 5 years of conflict over this. Wow. Within 6 months, the proposal that they came up with, which turned out to be a fantastic one, it was at least as good as the one the agency had been pushing, was fully adopted and implemented. And this was back in the 90s. And today, I was just at a conference in November of last year and was hearing from people how incredibly healthy that fishery is. And what a wonderful thing. It makes me feel, I'm proud, but mostly I just feel grateful that I was able to give that community the opportunity to be able to do this really good work. And because it was their idea, it was their policy, things like poaching are just a non-issue there. And somebody coming in and saying, we have a political change within the local government, let's throw this thing out. Nobody was going to touch that thing because the community owned it. It was theirs, not mine. And and again, what a great way to have a sense of hope about the future when that kind of thing can happen.
I just want to say that to me, that underscores our attachment to the land and how we're imprinted, how we have this deep relationship with the land around us, the
Yes.
ocean, the land, the sky. And I had a personal experience of that recently. So Paul moved me off to the Red Rocks of Sedona, a very beautiful place. It took me some time to adapt to it, but my eyes were hungering for the lush greenery, the 200-foot tall trees that I grew up with in the Pacific Northwest. And it's a yearning that you have for the landscape for which you identify. I mean, it's deeply emotional. And I was also struck because we look at archaeological artifacts in our work with our institute. And it was interesting to me to find one of the earliest and oldest masks that archaeologists presumed had an open mouth and open eyes, and that these were designed to be a vehicle through which the ancestors were said to speak for primacy, for ownership of a land. And so generations and generations of a families and a community fishing and making their living and knowing that land. I remember going to a beach in Hawaii and talking to a native elder there, and he was telling me how his family was there. Their totem animal was the shark, and the story goes that the sharks helped his family fish. They would never eat the shark. They would never hurt the shark. The sharks were, their friends showed them where the fish were. And so that kind of deep identification was so interesting. So I can understand that when a community is empowered to find the solution that they know they must go forward with, but they want to preserve the fish, they want to preserve the ecosystem, they want science to help them find the ways and the means in a cooperative way. I mean, that makes such perfect sense.
Absolutely. And I think that a couple of aspects that really make that concept work better are, as a scientist, I start by highlighting the uncertainty that's involved so that we all adopt a mindset that we are doing this process of navigating through an uncertain future, because that's something that we can come together around. It also, ironically, I remember the first time I ever did this, and I was extremely pleasantly surprised that the credibility I had with my audience when I admitted that I didn't know a lot of things went through the roof. So me saying I don't know turned out to be one of the most useful things I could do to not only gain a sense of trust from people, but for them to actually then really want to hear the other things I could tell them about. So that is a really key aspect of all of this, is uncertainty. And in fact, we don't have to get into this now, but I would love talking about my own experience in discovering just how powerful uncertainty is to the mindset that we bring to all aspects of our life, and how I end up actually going back to school right before my 40th birthday to an economics program. But my goal with that economics program was to have a really deep understanding of the psychology and of decision making under uncertainty, so that I could make sure that this process that I use was going to engage the best parts of us rather than the worst.
Oh, I have long ago made friends with the unknowns.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, let's address uncertainty a little deeper.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, do you have a specific question? Okay. Yeah. Well, so but maybe I'll tell you a little bit. I'll tell the story of how I discovered this. So if there are any other geeky scientists on the call, you'll know this. The top journals in the world, Nature and Science, which publish the most visible research done in science, are the column space there is a premium. So they'll stop an article and then just start another article on the same column right below it. At the time that I was working in the Virgin Islands, I had no library. So when I would go to the mainland, I would Xerox copy, lots and lots of paper, so I'd have them to read. And I double side them because I wanted to use less paper and carry less things around. Anyway, so one of these papers that I had intentionally chosen was upside down. And so that meant that when that article ended, there was the title of another article right below it, that was not what I intended to do. And that happened, that copy I had happened to be upside down in my office. And I saw the title of the following article, and I thought, I don't remember copying that article, but it looks really interesting. And so it turns out that article was by a couple of guys who later got the Nobel Prize in economics for decision making under uncertainty. I researched a little bit more, found another one of their papers, and I read that. And that paper was taking the lessons they had learned about the way that our brains work when we're making these sorts of decisions, and applied the implications of that to a corporate setting. So they were talking about manager this, manager that. And within 3 paragraphs, I could not keep my mind on the idea that they were talking about business managers, because literally everything they were saying applied to fisheries managers that I was working with. At the time, I was shortly after that, I was working with managers in the Caribbean, Pacific, the West Coast, Alaska, and Hawaii. And I was seeing these dynamics in all of them. And interestingly, my conservation colleagues all had this idea. Well, I shouldn't say all. That's horribly unjust. Several of my colleagues, who were very outspoken, believed that the systems were fundamentally corrupt because people were out there for their own short-term self-interest. But I was reading the issues that my colleagues were bringing up being explained just simply by the fact that our minds don't handle uncertainty well. And so I was hooked. And so the really short take of what we can learn from that is that when we're faced with making a decision, and it's about an uncertain future, so we're not deciding we want this outcome or we want that outcome. What we're deciding is we want to take this strategy that has leanings towards maybe having more of a chance of having this one outcome, but there's lots of different things that could happen. When we're making a decision like that, our most frequent, our most natural reaction to that is to say, that uncertainty is a little scary, it makes me kind of uncomfortable, so I'm just going to ignore it. And I'm going to assume, I'm going to be optimistic, I'm going to assume that I will sort that out later if something bad happens. So we have this innate tendency to ignore uncertainty. And that can be frustrating when we're sitting there trying to say something like, hey, climate change is real. But it's a really healthy, natural thing for us to do, because if you don't do that, you walk through life being worried about every possible thing that could go wrong. And that, that's literally a mental health disorder. So it's important that we do that. But it also then creates problems when we do that, when we could be engaging in something important. But it gets worse. The second most common reaction we have to this is to recognize that there's uncertainty and then basically to panic about it. And so I read that and I thought, this is every environmental issue I've ever heard of. We have one side that's saying, we can deal with this later. We need to do more study. Let's not worry about it. You all are just being, you all are panicking. And then another side saying, the sky is going to fall tomorrow unless we fall on our swords and do whatever we can possibly to be able to address this one issue. And it turns out it's worse than that, because now you take those two sets of people and you put them into an environment where they're supposed to engage in a discussion.
And that explains a lot, doesn't it?
It does.
What we see today.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's not only that people have that reaction, but put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's trying to ignore something because it's getting in the way of your peace. You're like, I can deal with that later. I have confidence. I don't want to have this be something I'm carrying around with me. Yeah. If there's another group of people that are yelling at you that this is like, we're all going to die, and that you're being a terrible person for not addressing it, it's one of the worst things that somebody could do to you, right? So you're not going to be happy with them. And vice versa. If you're there having this, oh my God, this is a terrible situation, and I feel I really need to do something.
Wake up,
right now, or else I'm going to be really afraid of this. And there are people that are saying, you're just being paranoid. Don't worry about it. That's also the last thing you want to hear. So now we have groups of people that are pushing each other's buttons in terrible ways, and it's almost inevitable that we're going to dehumanize each other at that point. And when we dehumanize each other, now we're in an environment where we're not having a discussion about where are places where we can find common ground, Where are the hard questions where we need to work together to find some kind of a reasonable compromise? Or coming back to my process, what kind of a target do we want to choose, and how do we set up a system where we're monitoring how we're doing and make changes together to move forward? None of that. There's no togetherness in that. Instead, it's a battle of, I'm right, no, I'm right. That's where science becomes a weapon. I really dislike the phrase that people will say was, well, I like the science solution, because science doesn't give us a solution. Science gives us identification of problems, and it gives us some implications of what different potential solutions could do for us. But ultimately, the solution comes from what are our values, what are our objectives, and we don't all agree on that. So if we want to do this right, we have to find ways to be able to work together.
Okay, let me ask you about another factor.
Yeah, please.
So I was reading an article about, I think it was Bali maybe, but there was a community where they had cisterns and water management that long ago had been set up through the temples.
Mhm.
Temples were the civic control for water and its distribution to the rice paddies and the farmers and the canals and how much water went where.
Yes.
It was under control. Because why? Because water is sacred.
Yeah.
And water is manna from heaven. Water is Mother Earth's
Yeah.
gift
There's an
to
amazing
humanity.
temple in Bali devoted entirely to water. So this makes a lot of sense.
okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And so they came in recently with a new system, the Western method, the Western scientific method, you know, and everything went to hell.
Mhm.
So people, drought, mismanagement, political bickering, the whole thing. And then they started to discover that when an historian came in and looked into, well, how was this water managed? What was the temple's role? What was the role of the priests? They found that it was all beautifully managed in cooperation because of this one overriding mindset. This is a sacred resource,
Mhm.
and we are all here to come together. And there was something about when one farmer had an incentive to cooperate with his neighbor, because then if his crops also grew well, there weren't pests that could come in and
Mhm.
start to decimate both of their crops.
Mhm.
And so there were real environmental incentives as well for cooperation. And so I'm thinking, oh, okay, didn't our ancestors figure something out? They survived.
Yeah,
They
absolutely.
handed us legacies that perhaps we need to pay attention to and maybe look at those dynamics and how they worked it out, not with two sides at odds, but also an overriding, hey, we're the sacred. You can't argue with the sacred. You
Mhm.
can't argue with nature. Let's work
Well,
with nature, not against her.
right. It's
Because, yeah.
yeah, no, and I love that story. It's to bring that to an even higher level. I think one of the challenges with having sacred based rules these days is that people have very different senses of what that means, and there are a lot of people that don't have much of a sense of what is sacred. But I do think that what you get from having this common sense of value is that now there's something where when we have a dispute about that water, it can be based on, well, does this match these values that we're trying to achieve or not? So here's the cool part, because I've actually done a moderate amount of research into anthropological case studies of societies, specifically to see how fisheries have been managed in terms of sort of Western civilization, pre-European contact. There's some really neat stories there, but I guess the point I want to say is that in the majority of the world, those systems have, kind of fallen apart. That even at a local level now, and fisheries is actually a great example of this. Even if you might have something happening at a very local level, they're now very often competing with larger boats that are coming from other parts of their country, and potentially even larger boats that are coming from outside of the country. And when it comes down to it, this is a really important issue, or an important consideration when we're making any kind of environmental policy. Almost any environmental policy is saying, let's make a sacrifice today because it's going to benefit us tomorrow. And if people feel that the sacrifice that I'm making today is just going to be, it's not going to come to me tomorrow because somebody else is going to come and take this thing that I chose not to. It's going to be very difficult to get me to be engaged in that system, because enough people will recognize this is really not supporting me in the long run. And as soon as you have a community that doesn't really believe in the rules that we have, then there's no incentive for them to follow the rules. And for the vast majority of things that we're doing, it's interesting. There's a lot of discussion in the fisheries space about what we can do to do enforcement against these big outside boats that are coming in. But oftentimes there's just as much of a problem that these local communities have lost their faith in collective action. And because of that, isn't willingness for them to follow rules either. And so the good news, though, is that I've honed this process that I use as a way of being able to, number one, I recognize and honor that people have their values and objectives that they're bringing to this, and that very few of those are fundamentally evil. And when I'm able to bring communities together where they hear each other talking about that through me as kind of an objective outsider, it validates that this isn't somebody just being a jerk. It's actually a totally reasonable perspective. When that happens, that does a whole lot to get people out of this mindset of I'm ignoring this thing or I'm freaking out about this thing. And it humanizes us. So now, instead of seeing the person on the other side of this issue as just somebody who's really pushing my buttons, I see them as, oh, this person has just a different perspective than I do. And then our brains bring in a very different sort of tack on this, which is, let's be problem solvers. And also, by the way, conflict sucks, and I don't want to have conflict unless there's a really good reason for it. Put those two tendencies together, and people can be extremely compassionate, empathetic, and practical in coming up with ways of addressing things together. So that's why I love it when, my goal is not to come in and push an agenda. My goal is to empower communities to have that discussion. Because when they do, they come up with amazing things. And they're ones that oftentimes I would never even dream of. So getting at this idea of what is the common purpose turns out to be really powerful. And I can share a fun story about that, if that's all right.
Okay, but let me also just
sure, go for it.
What you were describing to me, and you said that you've looked at anthropological communities of the past and how did they handle this?
Yeah.
It just reminds me of their taboos.
Mm-hmm.
And I've talked enough with a few elders in places that we've traveled, and they give little talks and they talk about the taboos. Oh, we can only harvest this particular plant or resource during this season for this short amount of time, and then it's taboo. And you don't cross the taboos. You don't cross the culture. You
Yep.
maintain the culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in talking with another anthropologist about how people in the past, the culture that she studied, she said they were more interested in following their cultural identity because of what it meant to them,
Mm-hmm.
about their heritage, about their ancestors, about it was prayerful in
Mm-hmm.
what they did.
Mm-hmm.
They were more incentivized to follow that culture than they were to innovate sometimes. There could have been a simpler way, but no, there was beauty and majesty and heritage and about following these ways. So it impressed on me how much the cultural identity meant. And so
Yes.
no, you don't violate the taboos. And besides, the gods aren't going to be happy if you do.
Right. Exactly.
You'll be visited
Yes.
with some reprimand there.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
do you not think that that is a similar way that you're describing? Those cultures would you agree that they set those taboos in place as a means of management of resources?
Yeah.
Absolutely right. So there's
Yeah.
Very different examples of that, and I'll give just a really quick little taste of that. We can go into deeper if we want, but there's a fantastic study that was done on the Lower Klamath Basin in the northernmost part of California, which has some extremely like beautiful indigenous culture still there. The tribes from that area actually have a stronger say in their, sort of in their present and future than many tribes did in the US, because their culture was so powerful that the US Army could never defeat them. So when a treaty was signed over this, the
It
tribes,
meant something.
water and fish are absolutely like fundamental to our culture. And so there's actually wording in the treaty that says there needs to be enough water coming down the Klamath for that to support a healthy salmon run. And that has been litigated repeatedly to be able to support those tribes. There's 3 of them in the Lower Klamath. Their ability to be able to sustain their salmon fishery and all of the incredibly important cultural practices that go around that. So the study actually documented the way that they managed their salmon pre-European contact, and it's fascinating. Fishing was done using a technology where they built just basically something called a weir, like a giant funnel that had the capacity to be able to catch every single salmon that ran in the river. If people had just used that technology to full effect, they could have wiped out entire salmon runs in 1 year.
Yeah.
But they didn't. And the ways that they were conservative about this was, first, this was the primary fishing method. People didn't fish other ways, and you weren't allowed to catch salmon until a sequence of events happened that included the observation of the first salmon going up the river, the construction of this weir, and then a very elaborate blessing ritual by a priest. And that took something like 2 weeks. And during that time, salmon are making their way up the river. Even people are hungry. You're not allowed to catch those. It's taboo.
So you had a good number of salmon that were there and could spawn and then continue the cycle.
Exactly. And then after the ritual, they finally closed the top of that funnel. So now they were catching salmon. And I can't remember if it was 10 or 14 days, but they had a very specific number of days they were allowed to fish. And then they had to take this thing down. And it didn't matter if it was a good year or a bad year, that was what you got. And 2 things I find really interesting about that, going back to your point about the cultural identity with that, part of the religious belief there was that the redwoods that surrounded this river were the spirits of ancestors. And so there was pretty good enforcement. If your ancestors caught you breaking the rules, the belief was that the ancestors were not going to support healthy salmon runs in the future. So you would be cutting off your nose to spite your face. But I think the other thing that's interesting, there's a whole different study that was done looking at the density of people all across California before European contact. And there was good evidence to suggest that the salmon runs of the Lower Klamath could have supported a larger group of people than it did. And why?
I've read that. Yeah,
right. And so why were there fewer people? Is because they had this management system where they were very careful about the way that they fished their salmon. And as a result of that, there were fewer people in need when they had a bad year, but also meant that in a good year, rather than just sort of consuming all of that and maybe having population growth, they invested it in culture. So it's this beautiful story there, but with an extremely simple rule. So within the Lower Klamath, the rule was no fishing until this weir is constructed. And then again, I can't remember if it was 10 or 14 days of fishing and then you're done.
So they avoided the boom and bust cycles, didn't they?
Exactly.
They were all about the medium keel and maintaining. Yeah.
Right. And this turns out to be something that when you talk to people about what do we want out of our policies, what do we want out of our environmental issues, it turns out that
sustainability.
Well, sustainability, that word, that's an concept, but it ends up getting used in so many ways. I like to break it down. So I think there's 2 different aspects of sustainability.
Good.
One of which I refer to as robustness, which means that we have a system that even when the unexpected comes at us, we're able to address that. I know I mentioned to you when we spoke earlier about the use of rocket science for fisheries, and that is all about the robustness side of things. But the other aspect that people often think of as sustainable is that we can go out and fish today, we can go out fish tomorrow, we can go fish next year, that there's this consistency of opportunity. So when I'm getting in the weeds with my technical stuff, I refer to that as constancy. But it's food security, right? It's income security. And so by pushing less on the resource, they were able to achieve both of those things. They weren't pushing the salmon so much that there was any risk of collapse. And at the same time, because they were fishing lightly on this resource that could have potentially provided more, they were able to get through what, times when the environment wasn't being friendly to them, and it wasn't such a big deal.
They were
So
able to ride out nature's natural cycles and
exactly,
not
exactly.
accentuate their own robustness and constancy. That's a beautiful nuance.
Yep.
Tell us about how rocket science helps you understand robustness.
Right. So there's a fun story. There's an Arizona related story to how I came across all of this. So I'm going to touch on just because it's such a fun story. I love telling it.
Okay.
My brother, no longer married to his ex-wife, but when he was married, his father-in-law, semi-retired missile guidance system designer. So he actually worked mostly non-military. He designed weather balloons to where they would find the right altitude to be able to stay in one place, or like rockets that were going and exploring the moon. But nonetheless, Bruce and I had very different politics. And I would see Bruce regularly at family gatherings because my brother had kids much before I did. So I would travel to Arizona to see my nephews. Bruce loved his nephews, so we would be together a lot. And we actually had kind of a hard time finding things we could talk about until Bruce discovered that we had math in common. And in fact, Bruce, being semi-retired, went and read a fisheries textbook and came to me and said, we actually use the same math. We should sit down and compare notes.
Ooh, intriguing. Intriguing to a mathematician.
Super intriguing. So I managed to convince the conservation group I worked at the time to send me to Arizona for a week to talk rocket science. Which I'm very grateful that people trusted me in this, because there were definitely people that thought this was just me getting a free vacation to Arizona. And so day one, Bruce just sat down and explained the way that they use this very similar models to be able to have a guided missile actually stay on target.
Okay.
And as he's describing that, I'm like, wow, I can see the parallel of this. You have a target, and the missile has these sensors that 1,000 times a second are asking, are we on target? And the minute that anything's slightly off, it makes minor adjustments, and that keeps us on target. Right. That means that you don't even have to aim when you first start. You can pick your target, put that information into the algorithm and it will make all the adjustments. And it will make the adjustments if like a gust of wind comes through, or even if the target moves. And at that time in fisheries, we were also picking a target. We would say, this is the amount of fishing that we want to allow. But when that was wrong, which was most of the time, there would be hemming and hawing and excuses. Well, we've just had some bad luck. Wait a few years, everything will work itself out. Oh, well, now it's getting pretty bad. We're going to have to take a few years to study this to be able to figure out how to get ourselves out of it. And then going through a whole process of trying to figure out how we can get fishing communities to work with the government on making the reductions that would be necessary to address the problem. Add all that together, it was like a 10-year delay. So rather than adjusting thousands of times a second, we were just adjusting once every 10 years. And as you might imagine, within a scope of 10 years, terrible things can happen. And in fact, at the time, I was working on fisheries along the west coast of the US, California, Oregon, and Washington, for a group of species called rockfish. And the majority of those were in terrible shape. One of them was actually being proposed for listing under the Endangered Species Act. It was so uncommon, even though it had been a major part of catches prior to that. And so I had a small part to play in this, but the federal government actually decided in 1996 to change the way that they did management, where they would pick a formula that would make automatic adjustments to the amount of fishing opportunity that would happen as a result of studies that would happen at least every few years of how healthy the fish stocks were. So it was no longer we're going to wait until something bad happens, and then we're going to take our time to figure out what we're going to do about it. All of that stuff was agreed upon ahead of time. It's like, sort of a
Take the temperature before the patient dies.
absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And then to have the remedy for that in place. And it turns out that doing that is extremely powerful, because now we're working more like a guided missile than a cannonball, which is really what we used to do. But the other great thing about it that I use quite a bit is that if somebody tells me what their formula is, I can do an analysis on it, and I can tell them how good it's going to be at constancy, how good it's going to be at robustness,
Ah,
how good it's going to be at maintaining a general, like whether there's going to be a lot of fish catch there or maybe not so much fish catch. And I can even tell them, generally speaking, is this going to mean that there's going to be a lot of fish in the ocean or not so many fish in the ocean? And that then allows us to have a really valuable community discussion of what among those four competing objectives, what's the balance that we want here? How important is that species ecologically? So maybe we want a lot of them in the ocean. How important is this to a big industry that really wants to have a lot of catch? How important is it that we have a really consistent supply that turns out to be really helpful, not only to the little people within that process who need that, that regular catch to be able to make a living, but also the supply chains. A Costco or a Walmart wants to buy something that they know they can buy next year and the year after and the year after. So you get a premium from that. So all of these factors turn out to have a different relative emphasis within each fishery, and even a different emphasis within different groups that are there. So a lot of my job is helping people realize that there are these competing objectives, and then giving them the tools to be able to understand each other's perspective on it, and then work together to find healthy compromises.
okay. A couple of questions, and then we're going to open this up to our audience
Sure.
here. But I've got just a couple. Number one, you mentioned the big companies, you mentioned the big boats. When you look at some of the big fish markets around the world, like Tokyo and wherever else, you go, how in the world? These things are so vast. They're pulling out so much marine life every day.
Mhm.
How is it possible the ocean can sustain itself? Can make those robust quantities
Mhm.
of wild? I mean, how can it keep going? Are we not
Yeah.
just pushing it to the end?
Yeah,
How is
thank
it
you so much
possible?
for asking that.
Yeah.
The ocean is big, and for certain fisheries, the capacity to be able to generate tremendous catches and feed us, right? This is really important. This is not just some company doing that. This is literally our protein supply, right? There are a number of species where we have the capacity to be able to just fish enormous amounts. Within the US, one of the biggest fisheries in the world is for pollock, which is, if you go to McDonald's and buy a fish fillet, you're eating pollock. A lot of sort of generic fish stick kind of things is pollock. And that is an enormous fishery. The scale of it is hard to imagine. The boats that go fishing are minor cities that go in and do that. But this has been true for a long time, that the group of people that have the licenses to fish that cooperate. They only sent a few boats up there. They could send a lot more, but they recognize the value of not overdoing it. In fact, the ones that stay home get paid by the ones that go fishing to stay home. So they've got this, it's literally a cooperative. And as a result of that, yes, there's very large boats, but they do things extremely efficiently. And if you're looking for, generally a environmentally sustainable, solid use of protein, pollock is a fantastic option. I recommend it. I'd give it a green star. I think it's better than many vegetables in terms of the impact that it has on environments, because it's well managed. Tuna is another fleet, and I'll tell you, I was just speaking to one of the key scientists for a group that is responsible for the regional management of tuna in the Eastern tropical Pacific. So if you open a can of tuna fish, there's a pretty good chance that's where it came from. Enormous boats fish in there. And this agency, which is an international agency, cooperative of lots of different countries that do that, have done such a good job on this that the guy I was speaking with made this comment. He said, we're not really worried about the sustainability of these species that we're targeting anymore. We have that down. They have controls on this. The large boats 100% of the time have to have an observer on there that records everything they do. And that those observers are run independently. They are under really strict rules to report things properly. So we have really good controls over that fishery. So
Yeah,
they're
but when
not
they
shifting.
pull up big nets and all the dolphins are caught in there too.
Well, that's
I
one of the
mean,
reasons they have the observers, is because if you catch dolphins, you get in trouble. So and there's a whole complicated, the dolphin thing is much more complicated than you realize. Dolphin safe is much more nuanced than most people realize. But what it comes down to there is that there are potentially conflicting values. But I will tell you that the IATTC, this regional organization, that they manage tuna and tuna fishing in such a way that is very strongly designed to protect dolphins. It does happen that dolphins get caught in nets sometimes, but it's not that common.
but also there's companies going after sharks, right? You hear about all the, oh, let's take a shark fin for shark fin soup and throw the rest of the shark away. So sharks is that true? Sharks are under
Some, for
duress?
sure. Yes. So that there's definitely a strong market for shark fins, and that creates an incentive for people to do things, whether there's control or not of it.
Right.
And oftentimes
Like
that is
elephant ivory, right?
right.
There's,
That is
yeah.
something that's hard to control, but it's also complicated. I'll tell you a quick little story about this to identify,
Thank you,
to help
questions.
understand that this is complex. I was doing a lot of work in Hawaii with the longline fishing community that are going out to catch tuna there. And catching sharks is something that happens fairly often, where the sharks will bite the bait that's on the hook. And so their perspective on the whole concept of shark finning was, first, that there actually are rules on the number of sharks they're allowed to catch or not catch. So we have management in place for certain aspects. There are lots of things that are unmanaged, but when we manage it, we can actually get in there and make rules about how many sharks are allowed. And if you're catching enough sharks that you're putting them in jeopardy, then we can crack down on that. So management is a good way to go with that. But what happens with the sharks that are caught are, more often than not, when they catch a live shark, they just cut it loose because it's a dangerous thing for them to deal with. This idea that they're bringing a live shark on board and cutting the fins off and then throwing it back alive is preposterous. It's absolutely preposterous, because, as one guy told me, we all have guns. We are not going to bring a live shark on deck and wrestle with it while we cut off its fins, then only to throw it back alive. They're going to shoot it.
Oh, I wasn't implying they throw it back
No, he's
alive.
just saying
But
that
this is a
Yeah.
common
a
misconception about
common
shark finning.
misconception, right?
Right.
No, I'm not that dumb. No.
So
And why would they care? If you're going to do that to a shark, you're going to kill it by taking away its fin. It's going to bleed
yeah.
out. I mean, what? Yeah.
So,
So,
but the
Limitations.
interesting sort of complexity of this is that, and this is older information, so this may not be so true at the time, but at the time, the crews that worked those boats were people that did not have a lot of power in society. That oftentimes they were foreigners, they got paid very little, and that a really important income supplement for them was that when sharks were already dead on a hook, so that the shark was dead. It's not like they were targeting it. Their bosses didn't want them to target it. They wanted them to target to them. But when a dead shark came up, the crew were allowed to cut off the fins, dry them, and then they would literally sell them before they came into port, as a way of being able to supplement what was otherwise a very poor income. And
I've just
I'm
seen
not,
films where you just see a sea of dried shark fins. So it was alarming.
yeah,
But
yeah.
leaving that
Yeah.
topic behind, I do want to ask something else. You had a question. Go ahead.
Well, it's kind of a different take in a different direction, but we're talking about food
Yeah.
source.
Yeah.
Of course, we know we have vegetarians and we have vegans, but there are many people nowadays that are discussing, is just fish itself safe because of all the chemicals and all of the pollution and all that kind of stuff as a food source? Is it safe for us? We're not doing it politically because of, because of being a vegan or a
And
vegetarian,
add the
whatever,
radioactivity in there too.
and all
Yeah.
of all these different concerns.
Yeah. So I appreciate that question. I actually got involved in fisheries because I love seafood and I wanted to have a source of food that I felt good eating. And I can say that in a qualified way that let me say this to start. I love it that there's this growing movement for people to be thoughtful about what they eat. And we have different values, right? This is one of the key findings of the work that I've done. So I'm going to share my perspective on this, but in no way am I suggesting that other people's perspectives are
Okay.
invalid. I respect anybody who's being thoughtful about this. I respect you. I appreciate you. My personal take on this.
Okay.
I would rather eat a wild captured fish that came from a well-managed fishery
Mm-hmm.
for several reasons. One is that is one of the few ways that we can have an economic incentive to maintain wild systems,
Okay.
because the alternative to that is turning things into farms. And the vast majority of other food that we have available to us is coming from a farm. And so while there's lots of great arguments for why eating tofu is better than eating something like a steak or a chicken that was raised in a factory farm, that tofu compared to the fish, it's a lot more complicated, because to maintain the farm that created the tofu, you've had to clear out a natural habitat. Actually, and a lot of that happens in sensitive habitats. You have now displaced the animals that live there. You have to do pest control on that. And so there's all these, we can't eat without having an impact. So this is an important reality that I've had to accept, that it's not impossible. But when you stack that up against eating a fish that lived its entire life in its natural environment, died a fairly quick death with most fishing techniques, and in doing so, supporting the continued existence of natural environments, I love eating the seafood for that.
Okay, my last question before we open it up. So we got to see some artifacts from the Ice Age in the museums in France from those cultures, the Gravettian culture and beyond. Sophisticated, looks so much like the native cultures here.
Mhm.
The hooks that they would use for fishing that were, what do you call it? Yeah, barbed. Thank you, barbed.
Carbs, yeah.
The cleverness of how they use the natural resources, the bone and the antlers and the shells and stone and everything. I mean, just so sophisticated.
Yep.
So, and then you go into climate change. There are cathedrals, which are those painted caves get shut down, mudslides shut them down. The culture moves away. They ate a lot of reindeer. Maybe they herded reindeer. Maybe they cultivated reindeer, but they moved.
Yeah.
Other cultures came in. I mean, huge upset for any culture to deal with climate change. That was the Ice Age going into our warmer interstitial period that we enjoy today. That is due to end. Regardless of humanity's impact, that's due to end. We're up ticking the clock at 15,000 years. So we're due for some upheaval regardless, right? So and I just want to just ask you what you see for the future, but also you see hope for our oceans. When the pandemic shut down a little human activity to some degree, we saw nature reflourish. So I have every hope that this planet knows how to regenerate. I have no worry for the planet. I worry for us.
Yeah.
But how do you read? What is the temperature you're taking for the future, both for the ecology, for culture? How are we going to brook this kind of change? What do you see? You study this.
Yes,
Obviously, it's part of your algorithms that you design.
Yeah, so this is a really a great question. It's a complicated one. I do find hope. I mean, I do, getting back to fisheries, if you're just to go by what people pick up from the news, there was actually one paper that was published in the 90s that said the entire ocean was going to be devoid of fish by the year 2032 or something like that. And this was during the period of time that we were working on the West Coast and seeing, these stocks that had been fished down to 2% of their original abundance that are now up at like 40-50%, which is what our aim is in fisheries. And IATTC, as I mentioned, tropical tuna, tropics, these are countries that you might think of as not having the capacity to be able to do this. We have healthy tuna fisheries. So when we actually apply ourselves to these issues, and when we use solid techniques, when we look at this as we're going to navigate through an uncertain future using some basic basic common sense with that, but including some rocket science to be able to keep us on target, that it's amazing what we're able to do. As you say, nature sometimes is extremely disappointing. Atlantic cod off the coast of New England and Eastern Canada. we've been trying to revive that fish stock for decades and have made very little progress. And it's heartbreaking because that's clearly a sign that something has gone wrong with that ecosystem. But it's incredible how many places we have seen things thrive when we just find better ways to be able to manage them. One of my favorite examples of this,
Or leave it alone, maybe
or-
let
yeah.
nature go back to managing it herself.
Right. And I mean,
Yeah.
the challenge with the idea of leaving it alone is that there are people, there are needs. And so my preference with that is to like say, let's work on this as a community, and leaving certain areas alone turns out to be a very useful thing. So that was my expertise at the beginning of my career, was if you're going to design an area that we leave alone, how do you design that?
Let it
And
recover. Yeah.
one of my early projects was on the island of St. Lucia in the Eastern Caribbean. And we were helping the government reconfigure a zoning plan for their ocean. You know, like we zone cities, we can zone the ocean. It turns out to be a very effective way to do things. And the fishing community was very skeptical about the idea of having closed areas, because they just felt that they were being displaced and they didn't believe that there was any benefit to it. But it turns out there was a local hotel there that really wanted a place for their guests to go snorkel. And so they had no legal authority to do this, but they hired a security guard and they roped off a tiny little area and said, this is going to be our snorkeling area. And within literally just a couple of years of that, the fish inside that area were incredible, which was a big hit for the hotel guests. But the fishing community noticed this too, and they became much more open to the idea that they could potentially benefit from some closed areas because they witnessed it in a degraded environment on a tiny scale. So the sooner we do this, the greater our chances of having a St. Lucia experience rather than an Atlanta cod experience. But you know, there is, and the language I prefer to use this is when it's nature, I like to use the word resilience. It's this like sort of fundamental characteristic.
Thank you. Another beautiful word. Yeah.
Yep. Whereas I like to use robustness for the idea of our management system have that sort of technical capacity. But yeah, so that this all gives me hope.
Thank you. Robustness, constancy, resilience. That's emotional intelligence as well, isn't it? That's good for us.
Yeah, well,
Those are qualities we can aspire to as
absolutely.
well.
And yeah, and this is really a fundamental part of my work, is connecting this. Yeah. There's a lot of really good science. It's true that there's a lot that's unknown, but there's a lot of really good science. And I take it as one of my major callings, is taking the useful stuff out of that and not dumbing it down, not simplifying it, but translating that into the sorts of things that really matter to people. And words like constancy, robustness, resiliency are ways of being able to take these very sciencey things and make them relevant.
So that kind of comes back to the original concept and also what we titled today's conversation, and that's bridging these worlds together, taking the technology of what you learned in the world of science and how you've applied it in this particular segment of society, but saying, wait a minute, don't get lost. This isn't just a fisheries discussion today. What we're talking about here is how can we apply some of these concepts and some of these applications of organizational skills in all aspects of our life. How can we pull this all back around in a way that we can manage ourselves in a more productive way, in a more insightful way? And you know, we're looking for solutions right now. I don't need to say anything. Everybody knows it. There's lots of divisiveness going on in the world in conversations. There's lots of problems. There's lots of challenges. We look to our political leaders to solve these things. I don't know. I think we're going to have to look to ourselves. We're going to have to look back.
Well, how can we be responsible members of the web of life? And how can we look and see all of the stakeholders in an ecosystem that includes the entire animals and land and Mother Earth and biosphere, the whole biosphere? We're just members of a huge biosphere. Yeah. So
which comes back to that original concept of when we keep referring back to what our ancestors and indigenous cultures talked about, is that it's common sense that you don't ruin your own supply. You have a
Right.
way.
You don't burn your own house down?
You don't burn your own house down. You
Yeah.
think about, and you also want your kids to have something when you're gone, and you want your kids to have something 7 generations or whatever down the road. So there's just
Absolutely.
it's common sense
Well, isn't it
philosophy
a
that
healthier life?
somehow we've got onto this thing in Western culture, thinking that these supplies will be here forever, and we don't have to be a part of the participation and what it takes for this to be managed. So anyway, coming back to this,
Let's open it up to comments and
right,
questions.
and that's what I was
And
just
let's
going to
start
mention.
with Alan Ismond.
Jim.
He's the gentleman I was telling you about, that he and his wife Abby are inventing a solution for the fisheries and water purification.
Yeah, it's a huge.
Can I announce that, Alan? Yes.
You already did.
Yeah, and I appreciate you making that comment for sure. Love to hear your perspective.
Yeah.
I've focused so far on the discharge from the seafood processing plants.
Hmm.
On the one hand, we have to sustainably harvest the resource. On the other hand, we have to efficiently use the resource.
Yes.
So seafood processing has a significant amount of water that's being used,
Hmm.
which we're constantly trying to adjust downwards. But I have plants that'll use as much as 16 gallons of water per pound of fish processed. Plants that use about 6 million gallons of water a day. These are enormous plants in Alaska. And the plants down south, they'll use up to 1 million gallons a day. That's a lot of water. And so when you put fish in contact with water, you get a lot of losses to the water. You get solid waste, like dissolved solids, suspended solids. So we've been working on finding ways to harvest more of the lost resource in the wastewater so that we make maximum use of the resource. Most of the technology available today is not amenable to harvesting seafood waste in a sustainable way. We use nasty chemicals, polyacrylamides, polymers that do a very good job of cleaning the water, but you produces a toxic sludge. So we found a way to treat seafood processing wastewater without using toxic chemicals. And we take the harvested solids and compost them or feed them to worms or a variety of uses. Currently working on a project, a vermiculture project, where we'll use worms to biodegrade the solids that we get back and turn them to useful fertilizer, or just composting the solids that we harvest back and using it, maybe making a useful soil amendment. So there's a lot of ways that we can maximize the use of the landed resource. The other comment I want to make was knowing yourself. Before you can solve the problems that are in the world, you really have to know yourself first. A lot of the solutions come within ourselves. You have to be tuned into what's out there. When you get tuned into the universe, you're more likely to find solutions to the universe. So the biggest tool I find is ourselves. The more I can focus on what I'm doing and not get distracted. And by the way, I wholly agree with the universe is unfolding as it should. As chaotic as things are, just know yourself, be true to yourself, be true, be honest, be spiritual, whatever that means. And you will find the solutions. I think when people get panicked, they start making bad decisions. They close in, they stop seeing things, they stop understanding things, and nothing good comes of that. So as bad as things get in your life, there's always hope. As bad as it is in the universe, the universe will unfold with or without us. So I prefer to start joining with the universe as it unfolds. And so I have great hopes, even though we have, the biggest challenge I have now is the government. The government of Oregon is now imposing wastewater restrictions that are out of touch with reality. They're purely politically motivated. They're based on ignorance. And that's a big challenge. I'm taking on the government, the state of Washington, Department of Ecology. They are not following the original rules that EPA set in the 1970s. For better or for worse, EPA said, all right, we don't want to lose the environment and the natural resources. So they enacted the Clean Water Act. And basically they said, we want companies to use the best technology available to treat their wastewater. Right. So it has to be practical and available. And then they said, having done that, we want to make sure your discharge does not harm the environment. So they define terms of what that means. Wow. DEQ today has totally corrupted that. They're saying that the EPA developed in 1974 technologies for each fishery. They said for hake processing, we want you to do this technology, dissolve their flotation or whatever, this technology, use screening. And that was the best technology available at that time. Today, 50 years later, there's the DEQ is enforcing the EPA regulations from 50 years ago. They're antiquated. at this moment in time is not the same as at that moment in time. So
Right.
dissolved air flotation was suitable for 1974. It's no longer suitable in 2024 because today we realize the chemicals they used in 74 are now deemed carcinogenic and very dangerous.
Wow.
So the other thing I want to emphasize, we have to preface everything with at this moment in time. At this moment in time, this is the answer. It doesn't mean forever the same answer. At this moment in time, it is. As I'm cramming too much stuff into the 15 seconds here, but those are just the points I want to make. But I admire the work that you do. It's wonderful to have dialogue. It's really wonderful when you have open-minded people having a dialogue. When you have people across the table from you who have a closed mind, have a set path, it's very challenging to not lose your patience and say, this isn't going to work. So what we're doing is we try to go through these people, not going around them. You can either join us or get left behind.
Yeah.
It's
And
interesting to see what you're up against down there in the trenches, in the weeds, so
I
to
think the
speak.
government should worship us. We've come up, I tried to I look for technology up until
Please
about
roll
5
out the
years
red
ago.
carpet, right?
And then,
Yeah.
and then when I couldn't find the technology, I said, I want this and this and this. So I put some things together. I said, hey, this works. So we got it patented and 3 patents. And so we're currently trying to commercialize that. I have tremendous interest from a number of people I've worked with for last 35 years. One gentleman calls me every year, says, you got anything this year? No, nothing. And 35 years later, he goes, you got something yet? Yes, I do. So we're going to join up together. He'll do the manufacturing of this product, and just marvelous when you work honestly on things fall into place magically.
Yeah. Right.
We've been following Alan and Abby's progress from the moment of inception to where they are today. So it's been a fascinating story.
We first interviewed Alan, I think, in 1994. So we've been having these discussions for a long time, and I honor you both.
It was on subtle energy,
Oh,
right?
that's true.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. You've had a
that's
wide range.
That's
Yeah.
true. That's-
When he says he tunes into the universe, he tunes
yeah,
in.
exactly.
Yeah.
But
So-
honoring you both for the work that you're doing and trying in a very controlled industry to be able to try to lead us forward in new expansive ways that takes all these different things into consideration. So Alan, you always bring good questions and good insights to the table. You two should talk on your own at some point.
You're both cat
'Cause
lovers.
you guys will
Yeah.
have the conversation that we won't be able to follow, but you two would get each other.
Any thoughts, any comments here?
Yeah,
Josh?
Alan, I also really appreciate your work. It's, that there's the way we move forward has to be a whole basket of tools because there's such a complexity of the sort of issues that we deal with. And it's clear that you and your partner have put together some really important tools to be able to make it practical to be able to protect our environment from this very real threat. So, my respect to you for that. I wanted to address this idea of government. So I have had both very positive and very negative experiences with governments. My preference when I'm working with communities is to keep the government out of it because when something becomes political, there's all these other incentives that come in that are not about solving the problem, and that has a tendency to get in the way, and that's worse today than ever because I was talking about the cognitive psychology that we are confronted with. The media today is constantly pushing the buttons to put us in those bad places to make
It
this
is.
right.
Yeah.
Either wanting to just ignore that thing that we're otherwise really worried about or freak out about something. And when you look at politicians, that's also become, a lot of what politics are just pushing the right people's buttons so that they show up to vote for you. And but I talked about that with that example in the Virgin Islands. So a fun thing about that was that one of the problems that they had for 5 years before we did that work is that it had been done at more of the political level. And so when I showed up at a meeting with a group of fishers from the islands and said, hey, we got a solution, all of a sudden that was every politician's idea from the beginning, right? Which is fine. I mean, I understand that the job that is there is a complicated job, and the incentives are there in a way that may not serve the way that I would want it to, but it does tend to be responsive when you have that strong ground up, sort of a bottom up approach, community supported tools that very few politicians are going to fight against it. I would say one of my examples when I'm teaching people about these sorts of things is to highlight the dynamics around gay marriage in the US, right? Where even President Obama was anti-gay marriage when he ran for president, believe it or not. And things changed very rapidly when it became clear that the public as a whole just didn't have any patience for that. So rather than try to make this a political sort of thing, making it a community one turns out to be, I think a more effective strategy. But this is the other point I wanted to make, is that when there are strong government agencies, they actually can do that, help to do that for us. And so I've done a lot of work with NOAA, who are the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They include a bunch of climate scientists who are fascinating people. I've had a chance to talk to them. But I've done, most of my work has been through their fisheries department. And our entire fisheries system is designed to be able to have the stakeholders show up and be able to deliberate these things. And it actually works pretty well. And so when other parts of government have become more political under certain administrations, for the most part, NOAA has been able to stay out of that. So government can be good. And one of the reasons I really want to make this point is I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about people who don't understand government well, that there's the politicians who are like a thin veneer on top of the government, but most of what we call government are actually civil servants who have a job of trying to, do the best that they can and try to avoid political interference as much as possible.
Sounds
And
like you might need to facilitate a little intervention for Ellen. So
Yeah.
Can I make a quick comment on the government and NGOs? Department of DEQ in Oregon is very, very sensitive to NGOs.
Yeah.
So when they speak, they tend to listen, because they got sued by an NGO in 2016. And so it makes it difficult for me to have a voice. They're more afraid of the NGOs than they are of my knowledge.
Yeah.
Because we just speak the truth and they think that they align with the truth. No, that they're afraid of the NGOs.
Mm-hmm.
So if we ask them to do something different than what they're doing now, oh no, they'll sue us on that. But you're doing the right thing by doing something different. So it's just a word of caution. The NGOs can be very useful, but can be very destructive.
Yep.
At the same time.
have
Yep.
you tried talking with them and getting a common solution with some of those NGOs?
The NGOs don't really like me because I'm not on their agenda. I have no agenda. I just want to make sure that we sustainably harvest and process the fish that we catch.
Mm-hmm.
They like it when government makes mistakes so they can sue them and get public sympathy.
Right.
Some, not all, just some.
Right, exactly. And I would say that I definitely have my detractors among environmental NGOs, but that the's also wonderful people that work there. So it's a complicated community. But
It's like everything. Yeah.
Having NGOs have an important seat at the table is wonderful, but that's one of the things that has got me in hot water with certain NGOs is I find it extremely valuable and rewarding to go and talk directly to fishing communities and to empower them to have solutions, because it's worked out really well. but yeah, that's we all have different values. That's totally fine. But yeah, but my goal is to get to that community level, because that's where we can have real conversations with essentially our neighbors and be able to sort things out. So yeah. But I wanted to throw out just one really quick thing, which is, it sounds to me like you're coming up against something where there's a policy that's kind of stuck in place. And I will highlight that one of the key aspects of my approach is that we never do that, that we make a commitment to come back and revisit policies on a regular basis based on whether they're doing what we had hoped that they were going to do. And what we hoped they were going to do is something that we decided by community consensus. And that we then use sophisticated and less sophisticated tools to be able to keep us on target, including coming back periodically and being like, hey, maybe we need to redo some of this. So I'm wondering if something like that approach sounds like it might actually benefit the policy arena that you're in.
Definitely.
Thank you. Tune into the universe. We can find our solutions there. I appreciate that, Alan. And the way to move forward is to use a whole basket of tools. And tools will change with our times, our discoveries, and our needs. So I'm taking that away from your exchange. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Alan.
Appreciate it. Good luck, Alan. Keep us posted.
Yeah, that's an ongoing.
Keeping our waters clean.
Hey, Lauren's got her hand up. Hello, Lauren.
Hey, Lauren.
Good morning. So I I want to reflect on, I think Paul had mentioned something about, the globalization of this, right? And so Josh, you have created a system. I really loved that. It sounded like one of the essential components was recognizing our relationship with uncertainty and our relationship with the unknown. So on a more global level, I'm curious if you can sum up and provide sort of a framework or a template of how to think about engaging in conversations with people with different philosophies and views, and how would you distill that down to the essence so that it could be applied in many different kinds of circumstances?
Thank you so much for your question, Lauren. So I actually have a formal system that I've developed that I call adaptive implementable management, or AIM, very purposely chosen as an acronym. And why? It's because very often, and I'm going to go into climate change for this because it feels like a really good example to address some of the issues that you brought up. Climate change is something that's very difficult to grapple with at a local community level, right? We can do what we can, but I like to think carefully about where is the real impact going to happen. And I would imagine most people can agree that our personal individual behavior is a very small part of what is mostly going to have to come from government policies or international treaties. So we have this, that makes this really challenging to address. But what makes it far more challenging is the dialogue that we have about it, particularly in the US. And I would characterize that dialogue as it's real, no, it's not. That's like a pretty good way to capture it.
Pretty much sums it up.
Right. And recall the cognitive psychology. These are the two elements of our brain that are coming in, and they're putting us in a situation where we're just going to yell at each other and fight over this thing. And the reality is that's not even the right question. So this is a key part of my broad advice for how we address these things, is to start with by saying, what are we trying to achieve here? And what we're trying to achieve is not a scientific determination of whether climate change is real or not. What we're trying to achieve is management of these greenhouse gas producing activities in such a way that we don't turn our climate into like Mad Max, basically. And it turns out I've done this personally. I can go talk to climate deniers in that way. And there's a couple of key things that I do with that I'll point out in a second, but get them on board with thinking about, well, what are the technologies that we have for this? What are the costs and benefits of them? And we actually do have this toolkit that we can potentially use. And maybe some of that's not quite as scary as it sounded. And yeah, maybe it does seem like a good idea to do something now, even if we're not sure. So a key part of that when I engage in climate forums is I will start by pointing out correctly, I had the chance to do an 18-month leadership program in NOAA where I got to go and talk to a bunch of the top climate scientists in the world, and they don't agree. So they came up with this message of we all agree for very good reasons. But the reality is it backfired because they gave the sense that, well, there must be nothing but certainty within the science. And then it just took a tiny bit of people pulling out examples to say, oh, well, okay, yeah, we don't agree on that, but it's more complicated, to destroy their credibility. And I could make a long story out of this, but I'll point out a fun fact. Michael Crichton, author of Jurassic Park, wrote a book called The State of Fear that came out in the late 90s. And that was actually the roadmap for the climate deniers. He had a personal issue with the climate scientists saying things too clearly, or too certainly. And so he actually, it's a bizarre novel. There's actual graphs from science papers inside a novel. But his point with those is to raise doubt and then to destroy the credibility. So what do we need instead? We need to have a sense of, well, what are we trying to do? And there are groups that feel that way, but that's not something that we've had as a dialogue as a society. Like, what are we trying to avoid? Like the summer that we're having right now might have been on the list of that. once we have that, then we can come up with policies that are designed to be able to address that, that are done through a discussion, not of is it real or isn't it, but here's this policy, what's going to be the economic cost of it, what are the indirect environmental costs there might be, what social and other human costs might there be, and to be able to come up with a toolkit for that, but then to be tinkering with that based on the idea of, are we moving in the direction that we want to or not? And so that's literally this process that I push, is we pick a target. That's why AIM is the acronym. And then we commit to being very thoughtful about how we move forward, so that if we're not going towards the target, we're adjusting as we go.
So many wars have been fought over the worldview, right? My worldview versus yours. So if you can set that aside and just find things that make sense to do regardless, like you're suggesting, maybe this is a good thing to do to help mitigate our climate.
Mhm.
That sounds like you've taken out the biggest barrier to the dialogue, right?
Right. So it's, yeah. And the unfortunate part is that in the world we live in, where there's a million voices all screaming, it's very hard to be able to get people to do that. But anybody who's on this call, whoever wants me to come in and engage with the group and lead a discussion about climate, let me know. I am there. I will do it. I will be more than happy to do it.
That's a generous offer.
And I've done this with groups that lean very liberal. I've done this with groups that lean very conservative, and there's stuff to be learned, because people are so stuck in this mindset of needing to affirm their belief that this thing is real or not, that we miss the whole concept, which is, this is really about navigating our way through an uncertain future.
Yeah. Lauren, in your work, you deal with a lot of uncertainty on a personal level. Do you have any insights as to you as a life coach?
That notion of uncertainty resonated strongly with me, because everything that we see in the present is based on the known, what we know, what we have already learned, and that came from the past. And if we're trying to navigate towards the future, we of course use the known to some extent, because that's our predictive nature of the psyche and consciousness. But by nature, we're stepping into the unknown. And if you want to create something new, you have to allow the possibility for the unknown. And so really, in my work, it's helping people get comfortable with that notion of uncertainty, because as you mentioned, Josh, the fear factor, right? It is natural for many people to be afraid of the unknown. And so if we can shift our relationship with that and be excited about the unknown, we can be in a dance with it, in partnership with it. And I think this speaks to much of the people in this room, their connection with the spiritual, the energetic, the sacred, the universal intelligence. It is always creative, it is always emergent, and so being willing to lean into that. But the reason I asked the question was I see how valuable that is on an individual level, so I was just curious how Josh does that in a group. And
yeah, well, so Lauren, actually I have a follow-up question for you, if that's all right. Right. So getting comfortable with the unknown is a really critical aspect of us being able to work together and move forward. And that in terms of a model for that, I believe that in my work projects, oftentimes people look to me as a source of comfort, as sort of a leader of sorts of these projects. And that's definitely one of the things that seems to be a common experience for us, is that if we can see somebody that we can feel like they're thinking carefully about this, I feel reassured by the fact they're doing that. But oftentimes these things are a lot more complicated than that, and there isn't somebody who would potentially serve that role. And in fact, that role can sometimes turn very unhealthy depending upon the leader. So I'm wondering if you have any insight into things that individuals can do in a group that doesn't have a strong leader to be able to promote that sense of security within themselves in moving forward despite the uncertainty.
Well, I guess for me that has to do with the structure of the group itself, right? What are the ground agreements? How do people relate? And at the top of the dialogue today, there was the discussion of the talking stick. That is one tool, but there are a lot more structured agreements that most indigenous circles have, and we have lost a lot of that in our work. I know I'm part of a women's group, and we come back on a regular basis to revisit the agreements because it's so common for us to break them, to interrupt, to disrupt, to go off on things. It's like, wait. And so to me, the safety of the structure of the group itself and what are those agreements and making sure everyone is aligned with the agreements creates enough safety for that. So that would be my
Absolutely.
first thought.
Thank you. That's
And
I
that
love
structure
that.
facilitating the flow, right? The flow and the exchange. So, and dialogue, such a lovely part of that. We say that we try to move the dial through dialogue.
Mhm.
Just so important to talk.
Yeah.
So thank you. And thank you, Lauren,
Yeah.
for all these introductions. Among all of the fascinating people at the gatherings that Lauren brought us to, she said, you must go talk to Josh. Go talk to Josh.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for
Lauren.
this. Thank
Yeah,
you, Lauren,
absolutely.
for all the work
Well,
that you do.
I have to
Josh.
shout out to Chris, who introduced me to Josh in the first place. So
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Hello.
Hello, Chris.
Chris, do you want to say something? Then, yeah, add to.
Well, I'm just blown away by some of the things that Josh does, the ability he has to bring people together in a open, non-judgmental way and attempt to understand the situation first, and then ask the right questions that kind of steers things towards a practical solution.
Mm.
And that's something I'm a big believer in, and something I admire in Josh, and I'm happy to call him my friend.
Yeah.
Nicely said.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you,
Well,
Chris.
Josh,
I do. I just do want to say a couple of things.
go ahead. You go
Yeah.
first. I'm gonna go.
We live on an oceanic planet. It's a
Mhm.
watery planet. We have what we imitate the ocean in the amount of water that our own bodies hold. We're finding out what a miracle water is. There was a meteorite that dropped to Earth, I read, and they quickly found it. They opened it up. They found water in a meteorite, a rock from space holding water. I understand the signature for water is replete throughout the universe. This is a watery universe as well, right?
Mhm.
And who was it who knew Gerald Pollack,
Oh, yeah.
who's looking at the fourth state of water, and we had that discussion. Was that you? Yeah, that was another. Okay.
Mhm.
Water being such a magical and mysterious element. And
Mhm.
Gerald Pollack's work is really interesting because he's saying that around living tissue, water behaves differently than it does outside of living tissue. So there's another magical property. It actually helps facilitate life in more ways than we had recognized.
Mm.
So just how sacred water is. And so I just keep, one of our missions is, hey, we are sacred. The earth is sacred. The cosmos is sacred. Can we get back into a mindset that all is sacred? Life is sacred. The inanimate is sacred. Everything is sacred. Can we treat it like that? Is that the mindset that if we truly come into that, then a lot of these policies will be shaped by that worldview? That it's really our worldview that needs some reset here. We need to right our relationships with ourselves. I agree with what Alan is saying. Know yourself, right relation with ourselves, with our community, and then with our world at large. Let's re-examine our place in this grand design of it all. So, do you do anything to help facilitate that? Is that outside your purview? Do you
Um,
bring in maybe
that's
some?
very much part of my personal experience. You know,
Yeah.
the water. Yeah, I appreciate everything you just said. There's neurological studies that show that just sitting by the ocean does amazing things to our brain. So the ocean is definitely something that we have this profound connection with. There was a study done many years ago that was identifying what are the traits that are the most human traits that we possibly have? And they did this really complicated study for that. Fishing turned out to be one of the top 10. So all the things that we're talking about today are things that we connect to at a very deep level. I guess what I find, in order to get people into this mindset, we have to get them out of one where they're fighting for survival. And that's a big part of getting people out of this, like this adrenaline fused, anxiety provoking mindset of I'm going to ignore the uncertainty, or I'm going to freak out about it, and I'm going to really dislike the people on the other side, is giving them the space to be able to actually appreciate. And when I witness people do that, it's just a beautiful thing.
That is your sacred work, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I can say, well,
That
going
is
back
your-
to the Virgin Islands example that I provided at the very beginning, one of the things that was fascinating about that is that the policies that they came up with were beyond the dream of any conservation NGO. But it wasn't based on conservation. It was just based on their own sense of values of what made, what they wanted as a future. And so whatever label we put on it, we do have that fundamental drive. So I think that's something that's really worth keeping in mind. Give people the potential to be able to allow that to come out, and it does. Oh, and one last point in terms of I love watching that people do connect to the environment. My favorite part about my work, though, is watching people connect with each other, and I think that's definitely also a spiritual experience when we move from being afraid of and angry at our neighbor to actually being happy that we have a chance to work with them. And so that's
I would like to introduce Pia Shaw, who we met at the News Cosmology gathering that we just attended, because Pia will be our guest in September. And I think that her work also speaks to this, and that she'll have something to say. And I want to pre-introduce her anyway. Pia, is it okay if we put you on?
She's turning on her stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm a little dark here. Hold on. It's
Yeah.
we're all of a sudden the skies just turned black and it's pelting rain. So in the middle of the day.
Yeah. She's back in Toronto, I think. So
Yeah.
so it was just fun sitting around a table with Pia and having these kinds of conversations. And also our friend Monica DeBras Bowles was at this with Brian Swim, bringing a native elder from the Suquamish, Paul Wagner, also known as Tiakcha. And just comparing that indigenous perspective with, hey, a cosmology, this new emerging cosmology perspective, and finding how these values are so much the same. The coming full circle was the comment that science is bringing us full circle to understand how magnificent this universe is, what a miracle it is that we all exist, that life exists, that we are really the universe expressing itself, that we are so much a part of it, we can't separate it out. What is nature is us. What we are is nature. That the same dynamics and patterns are at work at both. Why are we working at cross purposes to this? I think science has got a spiritual future ahead of itself that will help us, lead us there, and tie all the threads together. But Pia, we wanted to bring you in on this because what you also share throughout that weekend was also so pertinent to this discussion. I wanted to ask you for your input.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me into the conversation. Josh, I just have to say, there was a point I was just so overloaded. I've got so many notes. I'm just so taken by your mission, and I'm so enlivened by what you presented today. I'm a little speechless, I have to say. I'm processing a lot. So many things come up. One of the things that I can share, that one of the many things that I can share, is when you were describing the Lower Klamath in California project.
Yeah.
And you said, they had the priest there, blessing it. And I can see a lot of people like rolling their eyes, kind of go, okay, whatever, you know. Um, but how it makes sense, and how having the priest there, you know, reminds us of the most fundamental aspects of why we're doing this. This is sacred, you know, the fishery is sacred. And I think part of what, you know, what I'm trying to do is trying to, how do you convince people that, what are you talking about? It's just a fish. I eat fish. No big deal, right? So, you know, but this idea of what's sacred, and I think that's an area where a lot of us can come together if we sort of sit down and think about it, or be guided to the fact that, yeah, things are sacred. I was really taken by that. So part of my mission, I don't want to use the word mission, but I can't think of another one, is to
Passion.
bring out a metaphysics. Like, we've used religion as our metaphysics for what's possible, what's sacred. But I go down to, you know, what's the metaphysics behind that? What do we think is what's real? Like, what is our reality? What is our reality made up of? And if you think of, you know, the universe is made of dead matter, that doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. You know, you're gonna have a real problem thinking about the fish on your dish as being sacred. So I've, you know, I've looked at a process philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, who poses a different non-dual philosophy, which is quite beautiful, and brings into all these ideas of, yeah, the redwoods are our ancestors, and you can accept it because you realize before your other metaphysics wouldn't allow you to do that. So anyway, I was just sort of taken by so many examples, you know, the one being the Lower Klamath example, but I've written down so many examples from your real time and real life experience with this, that I can sort of, you know, kind of bring out this idea of questioning our metaphysics that doesn't allow us to go forward with this. And I think we'll find a lot of commonality if we can just sort of change what we think is real. So
We had a lot of
anyway.
discussions about Alfred Whitehead over those tables, and yeah, dead matter doesn't matter, but
Dead matter doesn't
sacred
matter.
matter does. Yeah, the
Yeah,
sacred does. Yeah,
yeah.
thank
So
you for
I love
that.
the etymology of matter. It doesn't matter. It's not something you put in your hand. It doesn't matter. It's nothing you can measure. It's nothing you can't see. It doesn't
But
matter.
you know, then when we really get down to it, you try to tear it apart, and there's no there, and you're
Yes.
left with the metaphysics. You've already crossed that line, right? And then
You know, I mean, we all run into a metaphysical system.
dilemma. Yeah.
Yeah. No, we all have it. We just, you know, we're just not aware of it.
Mm.
And so you know, I'm
Rather
hoping
like
to sort
the
of,
fish, you can't see the ocean because that's all it is.
Mhm.
that's a
And,
great example.
yeah,
Yeah.
there you go.
Yeah. Well, thanks. No, thanks for letting me pipe up. I wanted to, but I was feeling a little overwhelmed by the richness of this discussion. And I'm so thrilled to be here today to listen. So thank you so much, Josh, and
Thank you,
Laura,
Pia.
Lee, and Paul. Yeah.
Thank you,
Well,
Pia.
we will look forward to our discussion in September, Pia, when we really
Yeah.
get down into
Josh,
this.
you should join us for that one and come listen in.
I-
Yeah.
I'm a convert. I will be here. Yeah. So
Very good. Yeah.
I want to comment on this, but in a slightly different direction. So, and again, I mean, for me personally, the connection with nature is such a profound thing, and it's a key part of who I am. I also think that there's this idea of community is fascinating. So my first academic specialization was animal behavior, and I did a lot of work on the concept of altruism. And when you look at altruism, which is taking care of each other, essentially, like, you know, I'm doing something that's good for somebody else without any clear idea of how that might come back to benefit me. That within animal behavior, we look at altruism from an evolutionary perspective. And so the concept is that altruism only works if it is actually going to somehow either directly or indirectly come back to benefit me. You know, and I can say from a personal level, I benefit from it in ways that are, you know, that are not biological. And so that I'm all in on being an altruist regardless. But it's also really interesting to start looking at the conditions that favor altruism and the challenges to them. And, in order to be able to have an altruistic system be evolutionarily viable, you have to be able to have some sense of sort of like give and take and trust that people are working together. And I think this is actually one of the challenges we face in society today, is that there's so much conflict out there. It makes it really hard to trust people. I imagine we all go through that, and for good reason. Sometimes it's not worth trusting people. Sometimes we have to be careful about that. But I would say from my own experience, from my work, I'm a huge believer that working together creates a far better community than we could possibly have by being in conflict. And so being mindful of some of those conditions turns out to be a really important thing. And they are very much a vital part of this process, this adaptive implementable management process, is ways of being able to get people to come in together, to start trusting each other, to build on that so that we actually have a sense of community as well. And that, for me, that's has the same resonance as a truly spiritual experience as when I also get to go to beautiful places in the world and just exist in the nature there.
Beautiful.
Thank you. And why don't we just bring in a Thomas Berry quote, one of my favorites, that if I can paraphrase this: the universe is a community of subjects, not a collection of objects, right? When it is, and Thomas Berry being a geologian, not a geologist, not a theologist, geologian. What was it, Pia? And we met in the Thomas Berry Hall, so it just seemed appropriate to bring in that comment. But and I also want to just say that for me, novelty is the delightful stage for play, so that you have a firm base. But when you're exploring and creating, that's that creative juice of novelty and discovery and the aha moment. I love that space. I love where the two come together. I don't want to live in a certain world. That just seems rather boring and fixed. But I like the certainty of the hero's journey. I know that many heroes have trod that path before me, but that it's my time and my dance, and what I will discover that anew. So I appreciate when the two come together. I appreciate how the play and display of evolution, right? We spent a weekend talking about the universe is evolving. That means it is coming onto new ground. It is taking the past and it's pushing forward into uncertainty to create anew, for growth and discovery and joy. So, yeah.
I just wanted to add a point, just add the idea to about Alfred North Whitehead. He says the universe is built on novelty. It wants more novelty, but it doesn't want any novelty. It wants relational, harmonious, beautiful relationships. And the universe and the earth itself is trying to come into these, relational, harmonious, not simple. In fact, he wants really complex interrelationships, and then just for something harmonious and beautiful to come through. So that's one of the reasons I just really love Whitehead's work, because he expresses that so well. But I think it really underpins a lot of the things. I was just prompted by your comment, Laura Lee, really that universe loves novelty, but not any novelty.
Well, and also, as Monica had pointed out, hey, there's conflict. The universes collide, the galaxies collide. There's conflict out there. So it's a dance, right? It's a dance between chaos and order, and those two principles. Question is, how are you going to dance, right? What dance are you going to dance? So, well,
Hey, Pia, we look
thank you
forward
so
to
much. Pia, in
fun discussion.
September, end of September, I think
Yeah.
we should,
Yeah.
we'll hear more about that.
Yeah.
And
Thank you for
Whitehead's
jumping
philosophy
on.
and what it means to us today. Thank you.
Yeah.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
fantastic.
any parting words to summarize, Josh?
Yeah, let me just throw out
What
this.
fun did we have today here?
Yeah, let me
Yeah.
just throw a couple things out.
Yeah, please go ahead, Paul.
Number one is, let's face it, the planet's something like 70% water. When we say the word environmental concerns and environment, people think of trees and woods and forests.
In the air.
They think about the air, but the water is the majority of what our planet is about, and everything is based on it. So your work and what you're doing and how you're bringing this to the table becomes so important. So this was not a discussion about fisheries. It was really more a discussion about water. And I think that that's where all of us need to have a stake in that concern
Thank
of where
you.
we're going and how that all matters and how that all needs to be integrated. Part of the work that we're doing, and we're using a catch-all term, we're calling it global collective consciousness. And what does that mean? We're just using that term as a way of understanding that when we unite as a humanity, there's an interconnectedness that we have. We have a shared purpose, a shared meaning, a shared path of life itself. We need to integrate that more meaningfully, especially here in Western culture where we've allowed ourselves to become much more isolated, and we're returning ourselves to that connection, that need of being connected. And so, we use the term going from the me to the we. We want to step into that role of being change makers, being people that have chosen the path of opening our eyes up, taking off our blinders, our binding influences in our lives, and saying there is a greater mission in life. Let's all join on a mission together. So what you're doing, bringing the amount of attention to the sacredness of water, of the oceans, and also the fish and life itself,
And the relations between ourselves.
all of marine life, and that relationship. I mean, I think maybe the word sometimes gets overused, but that's sacred. That's sacred.
Thank
And
you.
so
In
the
our
work-
fractured worldview, we become fractured, right? But
Mm.
but what we're discovering is that nobody is healthy until everybody is healthy, truly healthy, right? We just
Yeah.
we're so interrelated. So
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
So now you get the final comments.
Thank you, Paul. No, I really appreciate your comments on that too. I feel very fortunate that I was immersed enough in some, like really getting down to the community level issues in fisheries and ocean conservation when I started my work. But I think one thing that I hope I can leave people with is that exposed me to dynamics that we're seeing across society with just about every political issue these days, and that there is hope because we've actually made tremendous progress in fisheries. I've played a role in that. I'm certainly not the only one, but we have systems that actually bring us together, and where we become a community that's actually working together rather than one that's trying to tear each other apart. So one of my next goals in life is to find ways to be able to take the lessons that I've learned from the work I've done on the ocean and be able to apply them much more broadly to things like climate change that we talked about today, other things we haven't talked about that I've worked on, water supply and water management, things that I would like to work on, including everything from managing a pandemic to immigration. All of these things could actually use the same basic approach, this adaptive implementable management approach, in a way that I am quite confident we would have a much healthier, much more productive way of moving forward into the future.
So are you writing papers on your adaptable, implementable management system?
Yeah,
Are
so-
you giving seminars? Are you giving workshops? Are you helping to give that
Yes,
to
so
a broader?
I train people all over the world on that, and with an emphasis on fisheries, but I'm also writing a paper that I'm going to go through the whole peer review process to be able to have that, officially sanctioned as peer-reviewed science, that I hopefully will have done soon. But I also have so many balls in the air that writing sometimes takes a backseat, even though it shouldn't.
We know.
Right, but you teach
Yeah.
this all over the world. Well,
Well,
thank
good.
you for landing right here for us
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
Right here and now. Thank
Chris
you.
and Lauren, thank you for introducing us, and wonderful to have you here. And it was a real pleasure. And obviously there's so much more depth to your work that we just scratched the surface of the surface here, but we appreciate what we've been able to accomplish in the last couple hours, and your
Yeah, a
contributions.
few aha moments there. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
No, and thank you. It's been a wonderful opportunity. I really have enjoyed chatting with you and this community.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Blessings.